Most students are making the exact same mistakes in English language paper 2, question 4, and it's costing them marks. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the biggest mistakes students make in question 4 and why those mistakes stop students reaching the higher bands, and most importantly, exactly what top level students do instead. And as a GCSE English teacher and examiner, I can tell you now that most students are losing marks because they misunderstand what the question is actually asking them to do. So if you want to feel more confident with question 4 and understand exactly what examiners are looking for, let's get started. Okay, so before we even talk about the first mistake, let's actually look at what you are being assessed on in question 4. Now, the question is testing AO3, so assessment objective 3. And the assessment objective says, compare writers' ideas and perspectives as well as how these are conveyed across 2 or more texts. Now, that sounds quite complicated, but actually, if we break it down, it tells you exactly what you need to do. So first, compare writers' ideas and perspectives. Now, this means that you need to compare the writer's attitudes, their opinions, feelings, viewpoints. So you're asking yourself, what does each writer actually think or feel? Do they feel excited, frustrated, anxious, optimistic? That's the perspective. But then the assessment objective says, as well as how these are conveyed. And this is really important because students often forget this part. Conveyed means how the writer communicates those ideas to the reader. So this is where you analyze things like language, imagery, tone, similes, metaphors, verbs, sentences. So question 4 is not just what does the writer think? It's what does the writer think and how do they present those ideas? And finally, the assessment objective says across 2 or more texts. Now that means that the comparison needs to happen throughout your answer, which brings us to the first big mistake students make: writing about the sources separately. Now, this does not mean you have to mention both sources in every single sentence, but it does mean your paragraphs should stay focused on one main comparison idea across both texts. So for example, you might focus on how both writers present travel, how both writers present fear, or how both writers present nature. And throughout that paragraph, you should keep linking the ideas together, not necessarily on every sentence. A lot of students do this instead. They write one full paragraph on source A, completely forgetting about source B, and then they write a second paragraph on source B, completely ignoring source A. And the problem is that the comparison becomes completely disconnected because the assessment objective specifically says compare across 2 or more texts. So the examiner wants to see links and references between the writers throughout your response. Think about it like this. Comparison means exploring one idea through both texts together. So for example, a weak response might sound like this. Source A presents travel as difficult. Source B also presents travel as difficult. Now, obviously, that sounds very basic because the comparison isn't really developed. A much stronger response would sound something like, both writers present travel as difficult. However, source A sees it as exciting and adventurous, whereas source B presents it as exhausting and uncomfortable. And then you might then choose to zoom in more on source A. So again, you're comparing both throughout. You don't have to necessarily compare on every single line. And honestly, one of the easiest ways to improve your question 4 marks is to use comparison connectives regularly. Words like however, whereas, similarly, in contrast, on the other hand. Now, these instantly help the writing sound more comparative. So when you're planning question 4, don't think, I'll write one paragraph on each source. Instead, think, what main idea can I compare across both texts? Now, another really common mistake in question 4 is that students summarize the sources instead of comparing writers' viewpoints. And this is such an important difference because a summary simply tells us what is happening in the text. Kind of like if you were telling your friend what happened in an episode of a TV show that you watched last night. You're just telling them what happened. An example summary would be something like, the writer describes bad weather during the journey. That's summary. It's just retelling the events. It doesn't tell us what the writer thinks, how they feel, or what perspective they have. But question 4 is not asking you to retell the source, it's asking you to compare. You need to think about what attitude the writer has towards the experience. So instead of asking what's happened, you should be asking yourself, how does the writer feel about what's happening? So a much stronger response would be something like, the writer presents the weather as overwhelming and hostile, suggesting that they feel anxious and powerless during the journey. So always think, what is the writer's attitude? Are they excited, frightened, fascinated, frustrated, overwhelmed, because strong question 4 answers compare. So how the writers feel about the experiences, not just what happens in them. Now, another really common mistake in question 4 is that students identify the writer's viewpoint, but forget to actually analyze how the writer presents it. Now, a viewpoint or perspective is basically the writer's attitude, opinion, or feelings about something. So you're asking yourself, what does the writer think? How do they feel? What is their attitude towards the experience? So what does the writer think? And then how does the writer communicate those ideas to the reader? And this is where methods come in. So remember, you're pinpointing what they feel, but then how they are expressing their feelings through the methods. So this is where you would analyze things like language choices, imagery, the tone, what verbs have they used, what adjectives, what similes, metaphors, and so on. Now, with this question, remember, you are not just analyzing methods on their own, you are analyzing methods to explain how the writer conveys their viewpoint. So a weaker response would be something like, in source A, the writer finds the trip difficult. Now, technically, they are identifying a viewpoint, that the writer finds it difficult, but it doesn't explain how the writer conveys that feeling and that idea of it being difficult. A much stronger response would be something like, in source A, the writer presents the trip as difficult through the violent verb battered, which suggests that the writer feels under attack by the weather. Now, the second response here identifies the viewpoint, it zooms in on the method, analyzes the language choice, and explains the effect. And that's exactly the type of thing that top band answers do. Whenever you identify a viewpoint, always ask yourself, how is the writer presenting this perspective through methods? Mistake number 4. Students waste so much time copying long quotations. It takes too long, it limits analysis, it encourages more of a narrative response to the question. What you need to do is just use short, precise quotations. So instead of a long quotation, for example, you might just pull out 2 words such as endless discomfort, or 3 words such as full of wonder. And then you would zoom in on a particular word from that quotation for analysis. Now, this next mistake is actually much more common than students realize, which is misunderstanding the sources. And honestly, this usually happens because students rush the reading. Question 4 is that point where you've been in the exam hall for around an hour, maybe longer, and you know that you need to get to question 5, because question 5 is where 50% of that paper's marks come from. So question 4 often is very much rushed. And what happens is students often look at just like the surface meaning, they focus on what's happening, basic events, obvious details, and they forget the whole focus of the question is about the viewpoints and perspectives of the writer. If you are misunderstanding the writer's attitude, your whole comparison basically becomes quite inaccurate. So, for example, imagine the source says, the rain hammered against the windows. Some students might say, oh, the writer enjoys the dramatic weather, but actually the verb hammered is quite violent. It suggests that the writer actually feels overwhelmed, maybe they feel trapped, uncomfortable, like they're under attack. So instead of analysing the writer's real perspective, the student has misunderstood the tone completely. And this happens a lot with things like sarcasm, frustration, irony, nostalgia. And students sometimes, I've noticed when I've been marking, they confuse frustration with excitement, nostalgia often with happiness, and sarcasm with actual enthusiasm, genuine enthusiasm. And once the interpretation is wrong, the comparison becomes much weaker. So here's a really simple strategy that helps massively. Before you start writing your answer, just quickly summarize in 2 or 3 words the writer's overall attitude. So, for example, you would just write, in source A, excited and adventurous, source B, frustrated and uncomfortable. That way you can just refer back to that when you are then writing your answer, because it gives you that immediate, clear comparison focus. And it stops you drifting into summary because you're constantly thinking about the attitudes and perspectives instead of what is happening in the texts. Okay, that brings us to mistake number 6. Now, students sometimes, I say sometimes, but it happens a lot, list techniques without explaining viewpoints. So, for example, the classic sentences are, the writer uses adjectives and similes. The writer uses verbs. Now that alone gets limited marks. We need you to analyze why. Why are they using these techniques? What are they trying to convey? What does it tell us about how they feel and their perspective? So what you need to do is always connect the methods that you find to perspective. So rather than the writer uses similes, you would say something like, the simile makes the journey seem dangerous, showing the writer's fear and anxiety. and you may then just zoom in on a word and closely analyze that individual word from that quotation. Okay, that brings us on to mistake number 7, where some students just compare in the introduction, then stop comparing completely. And this happens a lot, actually. What students need to remember to do is to think that through every paragraph that they are writing, they need to be thinking about the other source. They need to be making comparative links. Now, AQA guidance consistently stresses comparison throughout the response. And this doesn't mean you need to, compare on every single line of each paragraph. It just means that the examiner needs to be aware that you are aware that this is a comparison question and you are making reference to the other source. Now, the final mistake I want to talk about is making vague comments. And honestly, this is something examiners see all the time, and teachers. Students write things like, "This makes the reader want to read on." Please never use that sentence. They'll also say things like, "This is effective," and "This creates imagery." Now, the problem is these comments are just too general. They don't actually explain anything, because the examiner is thinking, as they are reading those sentences, why does it make the reader want to read on? Why is it effective? What kind of imagery is being created? You always need to push your explanation one step further. So for example, instead of saying, "This makes the reader want to read on," you would explain why. You could say something like, "This creates suspense because the writer delays revealing what happens next, making the reader curious and anxious." So keyword there, because. Now you are being more specific, or instead of saying, for example, "This is effective," you would explain what the effect is. So this is effective because the violent imagery helps the reader understand how threatening and overwhelming the storm feels. Again, more precise. And instead of saying just "this creates imagery," you need to explain what kind of imagery, what atmosphere it creates, what it reveals about the writer's perspective. So you could say something like, "This creates dark and unsettling imagery, reflecting the writer's fear and discomfort." Or, "This creates vivid imagery of chaos and destruction, showing the writer feels powerless." Strong analysis is always specific, precise, and linked to the question. And in this case, the question is on the writer's viewpoints and perspectives. Now, top grade responses usually compare throughout, focus on viewpoints, analyze methods, use short quotations, track similarities and differences, stay tightly focused on the question, make clear judgments about attitudes. Now, the simplest advice I can give to you, question 4, is compare plus analyze. So compare throughout, not separately. Focus on viewpoints. So what do the writers think and feel? Analyze methods. How are those viewpoints presented? Use short quotations. 1 or 2 words is enough. Stay focused on the question. Every paragraph should answer the exact focus given. I hope that was helpful. I will see you on the next video.